What if I told you that the greatest libraries of the ancient world weren't just storehouses of wisdom, they were carefully crafted instruments of empire? Behind their towering shelves and sacred scrolls lay a truth far more sinister than most history books reveal. These weren't merely places of learning, they were fortresses of control, where knowledge was hoarded, curated, and weaponized to shape the fate of nations. Picture this: a king's scribe etching decrees into clay tablets, a philosopher's words copied selectively to serve a ruler's agenda, entire cultures rewritten with the stroke of a pen. This is the untold story of how libraries became the silent architects of power. From the moment the first clay tablets were stacked in Mesopotamia to the legendary burning of the Library of Alexandria, empires understood something profound: whoever controls the past controls the future. Think about it. In a world where few could read or write, those who held the scrolls held the narrative. They decided which battles were glorified, which gods were worshipped, even which ideas were allowed to survive. But here's the twist: it wasn't just about destroying knowledge. Sometimes the most effective control came from preserving it, but only for the right people. Royal libraries were exclusive, their doors barred to all but the elite. The message was clear: knowledge wasn't a right, it was a privilege granted only to those who served the throne. And here's why this ancient game of information warfare still echoes today. Every time you scroll through a news feed or hear a debated fact, you're witnessing the modern legacy of those first libraries. The players have changed, but the rules remain startlingly familiar. So how did these ancient archives operate? Who were the shadowy figures pulling the strings? And what can their tactics teach us about the world we live in now? Strap in, because we're about to journey into the heart of history's greatest knowledge vaults, where every scroll held a secret, every librarian was a gatekeeper, and every empire knew the real power wasn't in the sword but in the story. The earliest libraries weren't the quiet havens of learning we imagine today. They were command centers of power, built by kings and priests to control the very fabric of society. Take the ancient city of Ebla, where archaeologists uncovered a royal archive of over 20,000 clay tablets. These weren't just dusty records, they were the blueprint of an empire. Tax lists tracked every ounce of grain owed to the palace. Treaties with rival cities were etched in stone, and royal decrees spelled out punishments for disobedience. The message was undeniable. Knowledge wasn't shared, it was leveraged. And then there's the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, where the Assyrian king amassed over 30,000 tablets. But look closer, and you'll see the cunning behind the collection. Alongside epic poems like Gilgamesh were manuals for divination, instructions for interpreting omens, tools to convince the people their rulers spoke with the voice of the gods. This wasn't scholarship, it was psychological warfare, when priests alone could read the will of the heavens, who would dare challenge their earthly representatives. Even the famed Library of Alexandria, often celebrated as a beacon of shared knowledge, had its shadows. Yes, it attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean, but only those approved by the Ptolemaic dynasty. Manuscripts from conquered lands were confiscated, copied, and sometimes altered before being returned. The originals stayed locked away, their truth reshaped to serve Egypt's narrative. Imagine a world where every book you read had been edited by the state centuries before printing even existed. That's the silent power of controlled knowledge. It doesn't just record history, it becomes history. What makes this even more fascinating is how these ancient tactics mirror our modern information landscape, today's algorithms that curate your news feed. They're the spiritual descendants of those temple scribes deciding which tablets deserved preservation. The struggle over whose stories get told, whose truths are amplified. It's a battle as old as civilization itself. The libraries of antiquity remind us that when we ask who controls knowledge, we're really asking who controls power. And that's a lesson every citizen of the digital age needs to hear. Consider the humble clay tablet, soft enough to imprint with a stylus, yet durable enough to last millennia. In the hands of Mesopotamian scribes, this simple technology became the ultimate tool for rewriting reality. These weren't just clerks, they were the ancient world's first censors, trained from childhood to wield writing as an instrument of statecraft. Every line they etched served a purpose: tax records to tighten the king's grip on wealth, royal chronicles that glorified victories while omitting defeats, even religious texts edited to align with the ruler's divine mandate. And if a tablet contained inconvenient truths, a quick dip in water reduced it back to mud, erasing dissent as easily as wiping a slate clean. Take the famous Code of Hammurabi, etched in stone for all to see, but not all to read. While its laws promised justice, their true power lay in who controlled their interpretation. Only the elite scribes could decipher the cuneiform, turning legal principles into weapons of selective enforcement. A farmer disputing his taxes or a merchant challenging a fine had no way to verify the rules themselves. They relied entirely on the scribe's word. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was psychological control, reinforcing the idea that authority flowed from those who held the written word. But the most insidious tactic, the systematic destruction of competing narratives. When a city fell to Babylon, its libraries weren't just looted, they were purged. Tablets celebrating rival kings were melted down, local histories were written to cast the conqueror as inevitable. Surviving records from Mari reveal how scribes would even alter diplomatic letters before filing them, creating an official version of events that justified their rulers' actions. Imagine living in a world where every document you encountered had been pre-filtered by the state, where the past was as malleable as wet clay. This ancient playbook feels uncomfortably familiar today. From edited Wikipedia entries to disappearing social media posts, the digital age has given censorship the same fluidity those Mesopotamian scribes mastered. The medium has changed, but the goal remains identical. Control the narrative, and you control the people. What makes the clay tablets so haunting isn't just their age, it's how clearly they prove that information control isn't a modern invention. It's a thread running unbroken from the first marks pressed into mud to the pixels on your screen. Beneath the marble halls and towering scroll shelves of the Library of Alexandria, something far more calculated than pure scholarship was at work. The Ptolemies didn't just collect knowledge, they curated it like generals assembling an army. Every text brought to its halls, whether willingly donated or seized from defeated nations, served a dual purpose. On the surface, it celebrated human understanding, but beneath that veneer, it was a masterstroke of soft power. Imagine a Greek ruler demanding that every ship docking in Alexandria's harbor surrender its books for copying. The originals kept, the copies sent back like hollow echoes of the real thing. This wasn't preservation, it was intellectual colonialism, a way to strip rival cultures of their narratives while positioning Alexandria as the sole guardian of civilized thought. Consider the famous story of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures. Ptolemy II didn't commission it out of scholarly curiosity. He wanted those texts under his control, translated by scribes loyal to his court. The message was clear: even sacred knowledge would bow to Alexandria's authority, and the scholars who flocked there, they enjoyed patronage and prestige, but at a cost. Dissent against Ptolemaic rule could mean exile or worse, erasure from the library's rolls entirely. The poet Callimachus, tasked with cataloguing the library's holdings, didn't just organize knowledge, he sanitized it, ensuring only approved works made the final index. Then there's the fire, history's great irony. Whether it was Caesar's troops or a later riot, the flames didn't just destroy scrolls, they revealed the fragility of centralized knowledge. In an instant, centuries of curated wisdom could vanish, leaving only the versions the empire had allowed to circulate beyond its walls. The real tragedy wasn't the loss of books, it was the realization that no single power should ever hold the keys to humanity's collective memory. Yet the legacy of Alexandria's control lingers. Modern universities, digital archives, even search engines grapple with the same question: who decides what knowledge is preserved, amplified, or silenced? The Ptolemies understood that controlling information wasn't about burning books, it was about controlling which books survived, and in that, their shadow stretches farther than any flame ever could. The quiet rustle of papyrus in an ancient library might sound like scholarship, but in the hands of empire, those scrolls were weapons sharper than any sword. Behind the towering shelves of Nineveh's royal archives, Assyrian spies weren't just reading history, they were writing it. Every intercepted letter from a vassal state, every captured map of enemy fortifications, even trade inventories listing grain shortages, all were catalogued, analyzed, and weaponized. This wasn't just information gathering, it was psychological warfare on a scale we'd recognize today. Take the case of the rebellious kingdom of Urartu. When Assyrian agents infiltrated its courts, they didn't just steal military secrets, they copied entire libraries of diplomatic correspondence. These scrolls revealed which allies could be bribed, which governors were disloyal, even which harvests had failed, leaving cities vulnerable to siege. By the time the Assyrian army marched, they didn't just outfight their enemies, they outthought them, exploiting weaknesses scribbled onto clay tablets months earlier. The library wasn't a passive repository, it was a living, breathing war room. Even seemingly mundane records became tools of domination. Tax scrolls from conquered territories didn't just track gold and grain, they exposed patterns. A sudden drop in linen exports might reveal a rival's economic distress, while temple donation lists showed which local elites were growing too powerful. And the most dangerous knowledge of all, religious texts. By studying the sacred rites of neighboring cultures, empires could manipulate prophecies, stage miracles, or declare their enemies cursed by the gods. The parallels to modern intelligence operations are chilling. Just as today's satellites track troop movements, Assyrian scribes updated maps with river crossings and mountain passes. Like contemporary data analysts mining social media, ancient librarians cross-referenced trade ledgers and gossip from merchant caravans. The medium was clay and papyrus instead of fiber optics, but the goal was identical: to turn scattered information into concentrated power. What makes these ancient spy libraries so unsettling is their veneer of respectability. While everyone marveled at the grandeur of their collections, few realized the quiet violence of their curation. Every scroll shelved was a choice about what truths to preserve and which to erase. In that way, the greatest trick these libraries ever pulled was convincing the world they were temples of learning, when in truth, they were the sharpest blades in an empire's sheath. Sacred texts weren't just spiritual guides, they were the ultimate tools of political engineering, carefully locked away in royal libraries to serve as divine justification for earthly power. In the vaults of Nineveh, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal stockpiled thousands of tablets filled with celestial omens and ritual instructions. But these weren't mere curiosities, they were psychological levers. When a rebellion stirred or a drought threatened stability, priests would consult these texts, emerging with prophecies that always seemed to align with the king's desires. A planned invasion became the will of the gods, a tax hike, a necessary sacrifice to avert divine wrath. The library's real magic wasn't in preserving knowledge, it was in manufacturing unquestionable authority. This playbook wasn't unique to Assyria. Centuries later, the Vatican's secret archives would wield scripture with similar precision. Bibles copied in monastery scriptoria often carried subtle edits, a verse tweaked to legitimize papal rule, a parable altered to condemn dissent. Even the physical placement of texts held power. Sacred writings chained to pulpits weren't just protected from theft, they were staged as untouchable relics, reinforcing the idea that truth flowed only through approved channels. The genius of this system lay in its circular logic. Ruler and religion propped each other up like pillars in a temple. Kings funded libraries to house divine texts, and those texts in turn declared kings divinely chosen. Break the cycle, and you didn't just challenge a monarch, you risked blasphemy. When the Babylonian king Nabonidus tried to elevate the moon god Sin above Marduk, priests buried cuneiform tablets denouncing him as a heretic. His own library became evidence against him. What's chilling is how seamlessly these tactics translated across cultures. In China's Han Dynasty, the imperial library curated Confucian classics with strategic omissions, turning philosophy into state doctrine. Maya codices weren't just burned by Spanish conquistadors, they were replaced with versions that twisted local gods into Christian saints. Control the scripture, and you rewrite the soul of a civilization. Yet the most enduring legacy of these textual manipulations isn't in the grand acts of censorship, but in the quiet omissions. For every scroll preserved, countless others vanished: voices of dissent, alternative rituals, entire belief systems erased not by flames but by deliberate exclusion. That's the true power of a library. It doesn't just tell you what to think, it decides what you never even get to question. Imagine living in a world where reading itself was a state secret. In ancient Egypt, hieroglyphs weren't just writing, they were a labyrinth of symbols so complex that mastering them took decades. This wasn't an accident, it was design. The priesthood and royal court didn't just control access to knowledge, they engineered the very tools of literacy to be impenetrable to outsiders. Scribes weren't merely clerks, they were gatekeepers, initiated into a caste as exclusive as any aristocracy. Their ink-stained hands held more power than swords, because while an army could enforce obedience, only writing could dictate truth. The system was ruthlessly efficient. From childhood, scribes were indoctrinated into loyalty, their education steeped in proverbs like, "The scribe's place is at court," reinforcing their role as extensions of pharaonic will. Tax records, legal decrees, even religious texts all flowed through their pens, and with each stroke, they reinforced the illusion that authority came from the gods themselves. A farmer disputing his grain quota couldn't check the ledger. A merchant accused of violating trade laws had no way to read the statutes. Literacy wasn't just scarce, it was weaponized, turning the written word into a leash on the populace. But Egypt was far from alone. In Mesopotamia, the cuneiform script was equally exclusive, with scribble schools training only the sons of elites. Survival exercises from these academies reveal their true purpose. Students copied and recopied royal propaganda, internalizing the state's narrative before they could even compose original texts. By the time they graduated, their minds were as aligned with power as their writing styluses were with clay. The consequences of this selective literacy echo through history. When Rome's emperors wanted to suppress dissent, they didn't ban books, they made education a luxury only the wealthy could afford. In medieval Europe, keeping scripture in Latin ensured only clergy could interpret divine will. Even the invention of the printing press triggered panic among elites. Suddenly, knowledge could bypass their gatekeepers. What makes this ancient strategy so chilling is its persistence. Today, literacy may be widespread, but new barriers emerge: paywalled research, algorithmic curation, even language itself used to obscure more than it reveals. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Control how people access information, and you control what they believe. The scribes of antiquity would recognize the playbook instantly. After all, they wrote it. When an empire fell in the ancient world, its libraries didn't just burn, they were erased with surgical precision. The Babylonians didn't merely sack cities, they waged war on memory itself. After crushing the Elamite capital of Susa in the 12th century B.C., they didn't just haul away gold or statues, they seized tens of thousands of clay tablets, carting them back to Babylon like trophies. But here's the twist: they weren't just stealing knowledge, they were rewriting it. Tablets glorifying Elamite kings were melted down for reuse, while administrative records were studied to exploit the conquered land's resources more efficiently. It was a brutal two-step process. First, obliterate a people's history, then repurpose what remained to serve the victor's narrative. This wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. Centuries later, when Rome crushed Carthage, the Senate didn't just order the city plowed with salt, they systematically burned its libraries, ensuring Carthage's version of the Punic Wars would vanish. Roman historians like Polybius later admitted the irony. They lamented the loss of Carthaginian texts while composing their own definitive accounts of events. The message was clear: history belongs to those who control the archives, but the most devastating example comes from the Spanish conquest of the Americas. When Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of Maya codices in the 16th century, he wasn't just destroying books, he was severing an entire civilization from its past. These weren't mere records, they were intricate folding books containing centuries of astronomy, medicine, and dynastic history. Landa justified the act as eradicating heathen lies, but the real motive was control. With the codices gone, Maya resistance leaders couldn't point to ancient treaties or land rights. Their history became whatever the Spanish chroniclers dictated. What makes these acts so chilling isn't just the loss of knowledge, it's the pattern. From Assyria to the Aztecs, conquerors understood that controlling the past was the ultimate power move. They didn't just want to defeat armies, they wanted to silence competing voices, ensuring future generations would only hear one side of the story. And in that, these ancient library burnings hold up a dark mirror to our own era of deleted tweets, edited Wikipedia pages, and disappearing news archives. The battlefield hasn't changed, only the weapons. Deep within palace walls, far from prying eyes, kings maintained collections more explosive than any armory, their private archives. These weren't libraries in any traditional sense. They were vaults of secrets, stuffed with scrolls that could topple kingdoms if ever exposed. The Hittite royal library at Hattusa wasn't filled with poetry or philosophy. It held meticulous records of every rebellion, every disloyal vassal, and exactly how the crown had broken them. Tablet after tablet detailed interrogation techniques, lists of informants, even the precise methods used to pacify conquered cities. This wasn't history, it was a playbook for maintaining absolute control. Consider the sheer cunning behind these collections. When the Hittite king Suppiluliuma crushed the Mitanni Empire, his scribes didn't just record the victory. They archived every intercepted letter from Mitanni traitors, every bribe that turned the tide. Future rulers could study these like military manuals, learning which alliances could be bought and which required the sword. The archives even included psychological profiles of rival leaders, their superstitions, their weaknesses, their succession disputes. This was statecraft reduced to a science where knowledge wasn't power, it was domination. But the real mastery lay in what these archives omitted. No records of royal scandals survived unless they served a purpose. Failed campaigns were rewritten as strategic retreats. Unpopular taxes were justified with doctored harvest reports. And when a new king took the throne, the first thing he did wasn't raise an army. He reviewed the archives to learn which truths to amplify and which to bury. The modern parallels are unsettling. Today's classified document rooms serve the same function: records of coups prevented, dissidents monitored, crises managed away from public view. The medium has changed from clay tablets to encrypted servers, but the principle remains identical. Real power lies not in what the people know, but in what only the rulers do. That's the enduring lesson of these royal archives. The most dangerous library isn't the one that burns, but the one with doors forever locked. Translation wasn't just about converting words, it was the ultimate act of cultural conquest. When Alexander the Great's successors took control of Egypt, they didn't merely occupy the land, they occupied its stories. The famed Library of Alexandria became a factory for rewriting history, where Egyptian texts were filtered through Greek sensibilities, stripped of their original context, and repackaged as exotic curiosities for Hellenistic rulers. Take the Hermetic texts, ancient Egyptian wisdom attributed to the god Thoth. Greek translators didn't just render them into their own language, they recast Thoth as Hermes, blending philosophies until the original teachings became unrecognizable. This wasn't scholarship, it was intellectual annexation, the same pattern repeated across empires. When Rome absorbed Greece, Latin translations of Greek classics subtly reframed ideas to align with Roman values. A passage praising Athenian democracy might be softened, while lines extolling duty and discipline were amplified. Even the act of translation itself became a power move by rendering foreign knowledge into the conqueror's tongue. Empires signaled that all wisdom, no matter its origin, now belonged to them. But the most insidious translations weren't of literature, they were of law. When Babylonian legal codes were translated for subject peoples, key clauses were altered to favor imperial interests. A statute about fair trade might mysteriously omit penalties for imperial merchants, while laws on property rights suddenly included loopholes for land seizures. The message was clear: even justice would speak the language of power. What's chilling is how these tactics persist. Modern museums full of interpreted artifacts, news outlets spinning foreign events through ideological lenses. It's the same game with a new coat of paint. The great library translators of antiquity would nod in recognition. After all, they pioneered the art of rewriting the world, one carefully altered word at a time. The bustling caravans of the Silk Road carried more than silk and spices. They smuggled ideas in their saddlebags, with libraries acting as covert way stations in this grand exchange of thought. Samarkand's legendary libraries didn't just collect scrolls, they functioned like intellectual customs houses, where scribes inspected incoming knowledge for contraband, ideas too dangerous to let pass unchecked. A Persian medical text might be welcomed for its remedies, while its philosophical underpinnings were quietly redacted. Buddhist sutras traveled freely, but only after translators trimmed passages challenging local rulers' authority. This curation wasn't accidental. When the Tang dynasty embraced Buddhism, imperial librarians didn't just translate scriptures, they rewrote them. Texts emphasizing obedience to the state were amplified, while those praising monastic independence were shelved deep in restricted archives. The same scroll could take on entirely different meanings crossing borders. A Buddhist parable about compassion in India became a lesson on tax compliance in Central Asian versions. Even the physical layout of these libraries revealed their true purpose. In Bukhara, the great domed reading rooms placed Islamic texts at eye level, while foreign knowledge was stacked higher, accessible only with ladders and permission. Merchants might barter for goods in the marketplace, but ideas were a currency tightly regulated by the crown. The genius of this system was its subtlety. Unlike book burnings that sparked outrage, selective translation and shelving left no visible scars. A scholar might spend years studying in Samarkand and never realizing half the library's holdings were kept in locked scriptoriums, their existence known only to trusted librarians. Yet the most lasting impact of these knowledge gatekeepers wasn't what they suppressed, it's what they allowed to flourish. By letting certain ideas circulate while burying others, they shaped entire civilizations' trajectories. The Buddhism that reached Japan, the mathematics that entered Europe, these weren't raw discoveries, but carefully filtered versions approved by generations of unseen librarians. Their silent censorship echoes today in every algorithm that decides what we see and what remains just out of reach. Walk through the towering columns of Rome's Bibliotheca Ulpia, and you weren't just entering a library, you were stepping into a carefully staged theater of imperial might. The marble floors echoed with calculated symbolism, Greek scrolls displayed beside Latin translations, subtly declaring Rome hadn't just conquered territories, it had annexed the very intellect of the civilizations it absorbed. This wasn't merely a place to read, it was a three-dimensional propaganda leaflet where every architectural choice whispered the same message: Rome was the inevitable heir to all human achievement. Statues lining the halls weren't random decorations, they formed a curated lineage of approved thinkers from Homer to Virgil, with Roman emperors strategically placed among them like intellectual royalty. Even the building's location in Trajan's Forum was deliberate, flanked by law courts and markets, reinforcing that knowledge, commerce, and justice all flowed from imperial authority. Visitors didn't just see books, they saw a physical manifestation of Rome's worldview, where foreign wisdom was only valuable once processed through the empire's cultural machinery. The scrolls themselves played a role in this performance. Many bore imperial seals or dedications to the emperor, turning each manuscript into a loyalty oath. Historians noted how certain texts, like accounts of republican virtues, were conspicuously absent or heavily edited. Meanwhile, shelves groaned with panegyrics praising current rulers, their bindings stamped with gold to catch the light. Like today's algorithm-boosted content, these prominent placements ensured certain narratives dominated while others faded into obscurity. But the true stroke of genius lay in the illusion of openness. Unlike the locked archives of Assyria or Alexandria's selective access, Rome's libraries were ostensibly public, yet their very grandeur created invisible barriers. The unspoken rules were clear. To study here, one needed the right clothes, the right connections, the right Latin pronunciation. It was inclusivity theater, offering just enough access to legitimize the system while maintaining control over who could truly participate in shaping knowledge. Modern parallels leap from history's pages. National libraries today still architecturally intimidate, their neoclassical facades echoing Rome's playbook. The way museums display universal art collections often follows imperial patterns of cultural appropriation. Even the digital realm mirrors these tactics. Think of how platform algorithms amplify certain voices while shadow banning others. The Bibliotheca Ulpia's ghosts whisper a timeless truth. When knowledge is housed in monuments to power, even the shelves themselves become borders. The act of burning books has never been about the flames, it's about the silence that follows. When China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered the destruction of Confucian texts in 213 B.C., He wasn't just targeting scrolls, he was dismantling an entire worldview. Scholars who resisted were buried alive, their mouths filled with the ashes of the texts they'd tried to preserve. This wasn't mere suppression, it was a declaration that history itself would begin anew, with the emperor as its sole author. But what makes these acts so chilling isn't their brutality, it's their efficiency. A single torch could accomplish what armies could not, the unraveling of a people's identity. When Assyrian forces razed the libraries of Babylon, they weren't just erasing records, they were severing generations from their ancestors' wisdom, their legal precedents, even their recipes for medicine. Without these texts, the conquered had no legal basis to reclaim stolen lands, no cultural touchstones to rally around, no shared memory to fuel resistance. The victors didn't just rewrite history, they left blank pages where a civilization's story had been. The Nazis understood this playbook perfectly. Their infamous book burnings in 1933 weren't spontaneous riots, they were meticulously staged rituals. Flames consumed works by Jewish authors, socialist thinkers, even scientists whose ideas contradicted Nazi ideology. But the real cruelty lay in what came next. The empty shelves were filled with state-approved texts, turning libraries into factories for indoctrination. The message was clear: knowledge, like people, could be deemed undesirable and disappear without a trace. Yet here's the paradox these tyrants never grasped. By trying to erase ideas, they often immortalized them. The very act of burning a book signals its power. Qin's destruction of Confucian texts only fueled their preservation in secret, passed down orally until it was safe to write them again. Jewish scholars during the Holocaust smuggled sacred texts in hollowed-out loaves of bread, proving that ideas, once kindled in human minds, are fireproof. What these ancient and modern censors shared was a fatal underestimation. They thought knowledge lived in parchment and ink, when really, it lives in the stubbornness of those who refuse to forget. The greatest libraries were never the buildings, they were the collective memory of people who chose, against all odds, to remember, and that's a flame no empire can extinguish. Behind the Vatican's towering bronze doors lies a labyrinth. Few have ever entered the secret archives, where truth isn't just preserved, it's imprisoned. This isn't some dusty repository of forgotten manuscripts. It's a carefully guarded vault containing some of history's most explosive documents. Imagine shelves stretching nearly 50 miles, packed with trial records of heretics, original Galileo transcripts with the Pope's personal annotations, even letters from monarchs begging for annulments that could topple dynasties. These aren't books, they're landmines of information, each one capable of rewriting history if ever fully uncensored. What makes these hidden collections so powerful isn't just their contents, but their curation. When Pope Paul V sealed the archives in the early 1600s, he didn't just lock away sensitive material. He created a system where even the act of requesting a document required approval from the highest echelons. Scholars granted access describe an elaborate dance of permissions, where one might read a letter from Queen Elizabeth I, but only after 3 other documents establishing the Vatican's official narrative were placed in their hands first. Control wasn't just about restricting information, it was about dictating the order in which facts could be encountered, shaping interpretations before eyes ever saw controversial texts. The Vatican was far from alone in this shadowy practice. In Constantinople, Byzantine emperors maintained the Chrysotriclinos archives beneath the palace throne room, where sensitive diplomatic correspondence and religious polemics were kept under literal lock and key. Only the emperor's personal librarian could retrieve them, and records show certain scrolls were chained to desks, not to prevent theft, but to ensure they were only read under supervision. Even the famously progressive Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad had their special collections, where philosophical works deemed too radical for public study were stored in a separate wing of the House of Wisdom, accessible solely to scholars who'd sworn loyalty oath. Modern parallels abound in corporate data vaults and government black sites, but perhaps the most telling legacy of these secret libraries is what they reveal about power's relationship with truth. When the Soviet Union collapsed, researchers discovered entire archives where dissident writings had been meticulously preserved, not destroyed. The KGB understood that knowing your enemy's thoughts was more valuable than erasing them. Similarly, today's tech giants archive our deleted posts and search histories in server farms, proving the old game continues. Real control comes not from destroying inconvenient knowledge, but from deciding who gets to see it and when. The greatest trick these archives ever pulled, convincing the world that some truths are too dangerous to be free. The scrolls of antiquity rarely bore a woman's fingerprints, not by accident but by design. Across civilizations from Athens to Babylon, library doors swung shut when women approached, enforcing a simple but devastating equation. No access to knowledge meant no pathway to power. In Mesopotamia, where the earliest libraries took shape, scribble schools trained only boys' fathers, passing styluses to sons like hereditary weapons. Even royal women like Enheduanna, the world's first named author, composed her hymns to the goddess Inanna under the watchful eyes of male priests who controlled temple archives. Her words survived not because the system allowed it, but because she outmaneuvered it. The exclusion wasn't merely physical, it was woven into the fabric of myth itself. Greek legends warned of sirens luring sailors to their doom with forbidden knowledge, while Egyptian tales portrayed goddesses like Seshat, patron of writing, as assistants to male scribes rather than equals. These stories weren't entertainment, they were cautionary tales reinforcing that wisdom, like sovereignty, belonged to men. When the Library of Alexandria flourished, its female scholars faced invisible barriers. Hypatia's eventual lynching by a Christian mob wasn't just religious violence, but a grotesque enforcement of this gendered order. Yet cracks in the system appeared where empires least expected. In the shadows of imperial libraries, women curated their own repositories. Roman noblewomen like Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, hosted private salons where banned Greek philosophies circulated. Byzantine nuns smuggled classical texts between convents, preserving Plato under the guise of copying psalms. Even the rigid hierarchies of feudal Japan couldn't prevent court ladies like Murasaki Shikabu from composing literary masterpieces. Her Tale of Genji became a subversive act, proving imagination couldn't be chained like a library gate. The true cost of this exclusion reveals itself in missing voices. How many scientific discoveries died with women denied education? What philosophies were lost when half of humanity's perspectives were erased from the record? The irony cuts deep. Empires that feared women's literacy birthed their own undoing. For when French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille, they found banned books alongside prisoners. And who transcribed those radical ideas into pamphlets that fueled the uprising? Often, the very women the old regime had tried to keep illiterate. The Forbidden Library's greatest failure was underestimating the persistence of those told they weren't meant to read between the lines. The marble floors of Alexandria's great library didn't polish themselves, and the ink staining its scrolls didn't flow from pens held by free hands. Behind every celebrated manuscript in the ancient world lay a hidden workforce. Slaves bent over writing tables, prisoners transcribing texts under guard, war captives forced to translate the very cultural treasures their conquerors had stolen. These weren't passive laborers, they were the living machinery of imperial knowledge, their fingers tracing letters they were forbidden to read, their minds shaping wisdom they would never be allowed to wield. Consider the Assyrian practice of deporting educated captives after military victories. When King Ashurbanipal sacked Babylon, he didn't just loot its libraries, he enslaved its scribes, forcing them to catalog his plunder while chained to writing desks. The very men who had once curated their homeland's history now had to annotate its erasure, compiling lists of spoils that included their own people. Even their names were stripped away in records, reduced to scribe number 12 or translator from Elam. The system reached its cruelest irony in Rome, where educated Greek slaves became status symbols for wealthy patrons. A Roman senator might proudly display his library slave, a trained scholar worth 10 times a common laborer, while denying that same man the right to enter public reading rooms. These enslaved intellectuals didn't just copy texts, they composed speeches for their masters, drafted legal arguments, even taught philosophy to privileged students, all while remaining legally classified as property. The poet Terence, himself a freed slave, captured the absurdity. "I am human, so nothing human is alien to me," words penned by a man who had built his owner's library while barred from borrowing a single scroll. But the greatest crime wasn't just the exploitation, it was the deliberate severing of knowledge from its creators. In medieval Baghdad's House of Wisdom, Persian scholars worked as translators under Abbasid rule, rendering Greek and Sanskrit texts into Arabic. Yet their contributions were often attributed to caliphs or wealthy patrons, their names fading like ink on reused parchment. The same pattern repeated in Spanish scriptoria, where Mozarabic scribes preserved classical texts during Europe's so-called Dark Ages, only to have their work later claimed by Christian monks as rediscoveries. The echoes of this erasure still haunt us today. Modern museums display cuneiform tablets without mentioning the enslaved hands that pressed each wedge into clay. Digital archives celebrate ancient translations while algorithms scrub away metadata about their marginalized creators. The bitter truth is this: the grand libraries of history weren't just storehouses of knowledge. They were monuments to a brutal hierarchy that still shapes whose voices we remember and whose we conveniently forget. The grand promise of ancient libraries to contain all the world's knowledge was perhaps history's first masterclass in branding. Walk through the halls of Alexandria and you'd see towering shelves labeled by continent, but look closer and the gaps told another story. Persian astronomical treatises were copied, yet stripped of references to Zoroastrian cosmology. Egyptian medical texts made the cut, but only after Greek philosophers appended critiques dismissing earlier superstitions. This wasn't preservation, it was intellectual taxidermy, where foreign ideas were stuffed and mounted to decorate Greek superiority. Even the library's famed universal acquisitions policy revealed its biases. Ptolemaic agents scoured the Mediterranean for texts, yet records show they paid triple for works praising Athenian democracy over competing philosophies. A scroll from Carthage detailing advanced naval engineering might be purchased, while another celebrating Carthaginian heroes was lost during translation. The message was unmistakable. Knowledge was welcome only if it came kneeling. The deception ran deeper than mere omission. Some of antiquity's most celebrated translations were actually elaborate hoaxes. When Babylonian star charts entered Greek collections, scribes systematically replaced the names of Mesopotamian constellations with Greek equivalents, erasing thousands of years of celestial observation. A similar fate befell Indian mathematics. The concept of zero was adopted, but its spiritual context in Buddhist texts was carefully excised. This cultural laundering turned conquered knowledge into colonial trophies, their origins sanded away until they could pass as native-born Greek thought. What makes this illusion so enduring is how it shaped Western intellectual hierarchies, by positioning Greek works as foundational, while marginalizing their influences. these libraries created a false genealogy of ideas that still lingers today. When Renaissance scholars later rediscovered classical texts, they unknowingly inherited this curated worldview, one where Egyptian medicine became Hippocratic genius, where Persian algebra turned into Euclidean theory. The greatest trick these libraries ever pulled wasn't burning books, it was convincing the world some voices had always been silent. The clay tablet catalogues of ancient Assyria might look like simple inventories at first glance, until you notice how certain texts were tagged with ominous red wedges. These weren't just organizational marks, they were early warning systems for politically dangerous ideas. A poem praising a deposed king, coded with symbols restricting access to senior scribes. A merchant's record suggesting grain shortages, filed under royal eyes only. The very act of cataloging became a form of censorship, with each classification decision reinforcing who had the right to know what. Take the Library of Ashurbanipal's infamous Tablet of Destinies. List a catalogue so meticulous it recorded not just titles, but the political reliability of each text's author. Works by court-approved scholars sat proudly in the Heavenly Wisdom section, while critical histories were relegated to the earthly accounts shelves, a euphemism for materials requiring special permission. Some entries even bore notations like "verify before copying," suggesting scribes were expected to sanitize troublesome passages during transcription. This wasn't library science, it was information triage. The hierarchies built into these systems spoke volumes. In Babylonian libraries, religious omen texts occupied the most accessible central halls, while treaties with foreign powers were stored in labyrinthine basement archives. Egyptian temple libraries went further. Their catalogues used hieroglyphic codes to indicate which scrolls could leave the premises, turning physical arrangement into a map of ideological containment. Even the numbering systems betrayed bias. Legal codes often received simple numeric identifiers for quick reference, whereas philosophical works were burdened with cumbersome alphanumeric strings that made retrieval deliberately difficult. Modern metadata echoes these ancient patterns more closely than we might admit. When a search algorithm prioritizes certain results or a filing system makes some documents needlessly complex to request, we're witnessing the same gatekeeping instincts that once governed clay tablet collections. The real power of a catalog isn't in what it includes, it's in who gets to decide where everything belongs. Callimachus of Alexandria wasn't just shelving scrolls, he was running an ancient surveillance operation. As chief librarian under the Ptolemaic dynasty, his famous Pinax catalog did more than organize knowledge. It weaponized it. Each entry in his massive 120-volume index wasn't neutral. It came with subtle annotations marking which texts deserved promotion and which required further review. A philosopher's work might be buried deep in the catalog with misleading cross-references, while court-approved texts glowed in prime positions. This wasn't scholarship, it was intellectual crowd control disguised as bibliography. But the real power lay in what visitors never saw. Special, restricted tablets tracked every scholar's reading habits, which scrolls they requested, how long they studied them, even the notes they took. Like modern data trackers, these clay records allowed librarians to profile readers. A merchant researching trade routes might find relevant scrolls mysteriously unavailable if his queries touched on sensitive imperial monopolies. A poet studying old epics could suddenly receive recommendations for texts praising Ptolemaic rule. The system operated on silent coercion, steering thought without ever raising a voice. The most chilling detail, many of these librarian spies weren't forced into the role, they embraced it. In Assyria, scribes competed to join the royal library's inner circle, where access to confidential records meant power. A cuneiform letter from Nineveh reveals one librarian boasting to his superior about altering a vassal king's correspondence before filing it, ensuring the archives told a version of events favorable to Assyria. These weren't reluctant bureaucrats, they were true believers in the idea that knowledge should serve the throne. What makes their tactics so unsettling is how recognizable they feel today. When social media platforms shadow ban content or search engines tweak their algorithms, they're playing Callimachus' game, curating what we see under the guise of organization. The ancient librarians understood something we're still grappling with. The person who decides what goes on the shelf also decides what stays in the shadows. And that's a power far greater than any single scroll could hold. Long before European manuscripts filled monastery shelves, the Americas hummed with knowledge systems as sophisticated as any library and far more portable. Aztec scribes painted entire worlds onto bark paper codices, their vivid glyphs recording everything from royal genealogies to medicinal herbs. Inca administrators tracked an empire's worth of data with Quipus intricate knots on colorful cords that some scholars believe could encode narratives, not just numbers. These weren't primitive attempts at record-keeping, they were parallel evolutions of information technology, refined over centuries to fit the rhythms of their cultures. A quipu could be read by touch in the Andean darkness, while an Aztec codex unfolded like a map, blending art and data in ways linear writing couldn't match. The Spanish conquest didn't just topple temples, it targeted these knowledge systems with surgical precision. In 1521, Cortés's chaplain ordered the burning of every codex in Tenochtitlan's royal archives, flames consuming centuries of Mesoamerican thought. Francisco Pizarro's men treated Quipus with equal suspicion, convinced the knots held secret rebel messages. What looked like cultural vandalism was actually counterinsurgency. Without their legal codes, native rulers couldn't prove land rights. Without sacred calendars, priests couldn't rally resistance around prophetic dates. The few surviving codices tell haunting stories like the Florentine Codex, where Nahua scribes worked under Franciscan supervision, subtly encoding forbidden beliefs beneath Christian-approved imagery. Even more tragic is what we'll never reconstruct. The Maya had libraries too, loose-leaf books called codices made from fig bark, filled with advanced astronomy and poetry. Only 4 survive. Bishop Diego de Landa's Auto da Fe in 1562 burned hundreds in a single day, a loss comparable to the destruction of Alexandria. Modern scholars pore over the Dresden Codex's Venus tables or the Madrid Codex's hunting rituals, knowing these are just broken shards of a vast intellectual legacy. What makes this erasure so profound isn't just the lost information, it's the severed connections. Aztec herbalists knew treatments European medicine wouldn't discover for centuries. Inca engineers recorded earthquake-resistant building techniques in Quipus now unreadable. When colonizers called indigenous people illiterate, they weren't describing reality, they were enforcing it by destroying the very systems that proved otherwise. The greatest library crime in history wasn't the burning of books, it was convincing the world the flames had only consumed blank pages. Think about the last time you scrolled through your favorite news feed or searched for answers online. Every link you clicked, every video recommended, every headline pushed to the top, these weren't random choices. They were the result of intricate systems curating information, much like the scribes of Nineveh deciding which tablets deserved preservation. The digital age hasn't abolished ancient methods of controlling knowledge, it's simply upgraded the tools. Where Assyrian kings once hoarded clay tablets, tech giants now stockpile data. The gatekeepers wear different robes, but their power plays remain eerily familiar. Take censorship algorithms, the modern equivalent of those red wedge tags in Ashurbanipal's library. When social media platforms shadow ban certain topics or downgrade search results, they're not so different from Babylonian scribes chiseling away inconvenient verses from captured poems. Even the excuses sound the same, where ancient rulers invoked divine will or state security. Today's platforms cite community guidelines or misinformation policies. The language has changed, but the effect is identical. Some voices get amplified while others vanish without a trace. Then there's the data mining that fuels targeted advertising. Those eerily precise ads following you across the internet. They're the spiritual descendants of Assyrian tax records, where every jar of grain and bolt of cloth was meticulously logged to maximize imperial profits. Modern corporations track your clicks just as obsessively as Hittite scribes recorded rebel movements, all to predict and influence your next move. The clay has been replaced by cookies, but the goal remains to know the population so thoroughly that control feels invisible. Perhaps the most striking parallel is in algorithmic bias. When a search engine consistently surfaces certain perspectives while burying others, it's recreating the same hierarchies ancient librarians enforced. Callimachus Pinakes' catalogue, with its subtle favoritism toward Ptolemaic-approved texts, would feel right at home in today's recommendation systems. Both create the illusion of neutrality while quietly shaping what users perceive as truth. The greatest trick, convincing us we're seeing the whole picture when we're actually browsing a carefully pruned selection. But here's where history offers hope. Just as persecuted scholars once smuggled forbidden texts under their robes or memorized entire works to outlast destruction, digital activists today find ways to bypass firewalls and preserve suppressed knowledge. The dark web's mirror sites echo the secret scriptoria where monks preserved classical texts during the Inquisition. Encrypted messaging apps function like the whispered networks that spread Enlightenment ideas under absolute monarchies. Resistance to information control isn't new. It's human nature pushing back against the walls every empire tries to build around truth. The lesson isn't that technology is inherently oppressive, but that power will always seek to weaponize knowledge systems. When we recognize modern data tracking as the great-grandchild of pharaonic grain inventories, or spot censorship algorithms wearing the same disguise as imperial edicts, we gain something precious: the ability to question what's missing from our digital shelves. Because the real danger isn't that history repeats itself, but that we forget it ever happened. Even as empires tightened their grip on knowledge, rebels of the written word fought back with cunning and courage. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just survive by chance, they were part of a deliberate, dangerous resistance. When Roman legions marched on Judea in the 1st century, a secretive Jewish sect called the Essenes didn't just hide their sacred texts in caves near Qumran. They sealed them in clay jars with mathematical precision, arranging the scrolls according to a code only initiates could decipher. These weren't panicked stashes, they were time capsules designed to outlast persecution. For 2,000 years, the desert's dry air preserved radical interpretations of scripture that challenged both Roman and temple authorities, proof that alternative histories could endure even the most ruthless regimes. Buddhist monks perfected even more audacious tactics. When Chinese emperors launched purges against monasteries during the 9th century, they didn't just memorize sutras, they turned their bodies into living libraries. Traveling monks tattooed sacred texts onto their scalps beneath grown-out hair, sewed pages into the hems of robes, even hollowed out wooden begging bowls to conceal miniature scrolls. The Diamond Sutra, now celebrated as the world's oldest printed book, survived precisely because it was deemed unimportant, hidden among mundane documents in a sealed cave along the Silk Road, its value unrecognized by authorities hunting for religious contraband. Sometimes survival came through sheer obscurity. Herculaneum's Villa of the Papyri was buried under volcanic ash in 79 AD. Its hundreds of scrolls carbonized but paradoxically preserved. Modern imaging techniques have revealed these lumps of charcoal contain lost works by philosophers like Epicurus. Texts the Roman elite tried to suppress for challenging state-sponsored Stoicism. Even the Vatican's secret archives couldn't contain everything. When Napoleon looted them in 1809, his soldiers unknowingly dispersed manuscripts the church had tried to bury, including heretical gospels that resurfaced in Parisian flea markets decades later. The most defiant survivors, though, were the ones rewritten into plain sight. Coptic scribes in Alexandria copied forbidden Gnostic texts word for word onto the backs of approved church documents, creating palimpsests where two truths coexisted on one page. Maya codices disguised as Christian prayer books hid original glyphs beneath pious illustrations, waiting for scholars centuries later to uncover them with infrared light. These acts of subversion prove a powerful truth. Censorship often fails because it underestimates human creativity. When you can't hide knowledge, you can still cloak it, in poetry, in art, even in the enemy's own sacred texts. What connects these survivors isn't just luck, it's the universal flaw in every system of control. Empires assume power flows from the top down, but knowledge moves like water, finding cracks in the dam. A monk's tattooed scalp, a child's bedtime story passed through generations, a scrap of parchment wedged between floorboards. These become the seeds of revolutions no army can crush. The real lesson of these resilient texts isn't just that they survived, but how, through the quiet, stubborn refusal to let any single voice monopolize truth. Who controls the past controls the future. George Orwell's chilling words weren't just a warning about totalitarian regimes. They were an echo of a strategy as old as civilization itself. From the moment the first ruler ordered a scribe to chisel his victories into stone while omitting his defeats, history became a battleground. The Assyrians didn't just burn rebellious cities, they erased their records from existence, ensuring future generations would know only the version of events that served imperial power. The Romans rewrote Carthaginian history so thoroughly that today we still struggle to separate fact from propaganda. Even the great libraries we've romanticized weren't neutral. They were instruments of narrative control, carefully curating which stories survived and which molded in obscurity. The methods were as varied as they were ruthless. In ancient China, Qin Shi Huang didn't just standardize weights and measures. He standardized thought, burning philosophical texts that challenged his legalist doctrine while preserving state-approved manuals on agriculture and warfare. Medieval European kings commissioned lavish chronicles portraying their reigns as divinely ordained, while their rivals' deeds were reduced to footnotes or worse, blank spaces where pages had been torn out. The Spanish Inquisition didn't merely ban books, it created indexes of forbidden knowledge that functioned like reverse blueprints for intellectual domination. If you wanted to know what threatened the status quo, you only had to see what they worked hardest to suppress. This wasn't just about vanity or legacy. Controlling the past had tangible, immediate power. When the Ottoman sultans seized Constantinople, one of their first acts was to claim the Byzantine archives, not to destroy them, but to study them. Those dusty scrolls held tax records, land deeds, and genealogies that could legitimize their rule over conquered populations. Similarly, when British colonizers looted Indian and African archives, they weren't just taking trophies. They were gathering the cultural DNA of societies they sought to reshape. Knowledge in the wrong hands becomes a crowbar for prying apart a people's connection to their own heritage. Fast forward to today, and the battlefield has shifted but not vanished. Digital archives now face manipulation through subtle means, algorithmic prioritization that buries inconvenient truths, paywalls locking away historical research from public view, even the quiet disappearance of controversial articles down memory holes. The burning of libraries has been replaced by the silencing of search results, the editing of Wikipedia entries, the selective preservation of social media posts. When a government scrubs its online records or a tech company alters its content moderation policies, they're playing the same ancient game, deciding which fragments of the present will become the official past. Yet there's a crucial difference. The clay tablets and parchment scrolls of antiquity had physical limits. Only so many could be copied. Only so many minds could access them. Today's digital landscape is both more vulnerable and more resilient. A single tweet can circle the globe in seconds, but a server crash can erase petabytes of data forever. The democratization of information has made censorship harder, but the scale of manipulation has grown exponentially. We're all unwitting scribes now, contributing to a collective archive that future historians will sift through if it survives. The real question isn't whether history will be controlled, but by whom. Will it be centralized platforms with opaque algorithms, governments with shifting ideological agendas? Or could it be something new, decentralized networks where no single entity holds the keys to our collective memory? The answer will determine more than just what future generations read about us. It will shape what they believe is possible, because when you control the past, you don't just dictate what happened, you define what comes next. The charred fragments of Alexandria's scrolls and the shattered clay tablets of Nineveh whisper a warning across millennia. Every library, no matter how grand, carries the fingerprints of power. These weren't just repositories of facts, they were ideological fortresses, their shelves arranged to elevate certain truths while burying others. Consider the paradox of Ashurbanipal's library, where the same hands that preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh also meticulously erased the names of conquered kings from Victory Stele. Preservation and destruction weren't opposites, they were two sides of the same imperial coin. This duality plays out in startling ways today. Modern platforms boast about democratizing knowledge, while their algorithms quietly amplify some voices and silence others. Ancient scribes would nod in recognition at the way trending topics and shadow bans replicate the old gatekeeping. Only now, the gatekeepers wear hoodies instead of royal robes. The real power lies not in creating information, but in deciding what rises to the surface. Yet history also offers blueprints for resistance. The monks who smuggled texts during the Inquisition, the indigenous elders who memorized forbidden creation stories, they prove knowledge has a way of escaping even the most fortified vaults. When Byzantine emperors burned heretical books, survivors scratched quotes onto pottery shards and tossed them into wells, creating accidental time capsules. Today's digital activists employ similar tactics, using decentralized networks and encryption to preserve truths that powerful interests would rather vanish. The most urgent lesson isn't about the past, it's about our complicity. Every time we accept a search engine's first page as gospel or share a headline without checking its origins, we're recreating the passive trust that let ancient libraries become tools of control. But when we seek out marginalized voices, question dominant narratives, and preserve inconvenient truths, we become part of a different tradition, one that stretches back to the underground scribes and rebel scholars who understood the fight for knowledge isn't just about access. It's about who gets to write the story.